So we are starting chapter 9 after we spent 2 shiurim on chapter 8 with Bnei Israel's request for a king. We now turn towards choosing that king. And we know that our first king is going to be Shaul HaMelech. As with many biblical figures, the Torah introduces the character, a little bit about them. And we have a very interesting story here in chapter 9 about how Shaul and Shemuel meet up first. And Shemuel informs Shaul that he's going to be crowned as king, which is going to come as a tremendous surprise for someone like Shaul. Before we read the chapter, it's important to understand that origin stories that are found in the Tanakh, and we find them for all major biblical figures. Just think to Moshe Rabbeinu, for example. We find out a lot about how Moshe is born and how he's raised and his shepherding, and then he goes into the death. We find out a lot about him before he's actually chosen for his job of being the leader of the Jewish people. This is going to very reminiscent of, not as long, but reminiscent of the story of how Moshe comes to be the eventual leader of the Jewish people. And origin stories, where they come from, who they are, descriptions, interesting beginnings, are there to sort of set the stage for why this character is the character that's to be chosen for a very prominent role in Am Yisrael. So as we're reading this story, we kind of have to think to ourselves, what is the purpose of this story? Why is the Navi spending so much time introducing this character with very odd details? It's actually a very strange story. Why is it important? Why doesn't the Pasuk just say, and Shaul met this guy, Shemuel, and he crowned him as king, and we're ready to go on? Obviously, the text wants us to know something about Shaul before he got to that position that's critical to the positives and negatives of his becoming the king. So that's what we have to think about in the back of our mind as we read the text. Yes, let's begin. Pasuk Aleph. What we're going to do is we're going to try to read through a lot of the story, and then we'll double back to try and break down the different parts of the story. Vahi ish mi Binyamin ushmo Kish ben Aviel ben Seror ben Bechorat ben Afiach ben Ish Yemini Gibor Hayil. There was a man from the tribe of Binyamin. His name was Kish, son of Aviel, son of Tzror, son of Bechorat, son of Afiach, the son of an Ish Yemini. Yemini means he's from which tribe? Binyamin, right? Gibor Hayil. He was a man of valor. Sometimes they translate a man of substance. Gibor Hayil can have many meanings. We say Eshet Hayil, a woman of valor. Gibor Hayil, a man of valor. And that could be on many different levels. It could mean he was physically fit, which we will see is the case, but also he is character-wise a very honorable person, a very moral person. He might be somebody who is affluent, which we'll see if that's the case as we go through the chapter, and so on and so forth. But this is high praise for such a man. Gibor Hayil. Velo haya ben. To him was a son, ushmo Shaul, and his name was Shaul. Bahur vatov. He was young and good. Ve'en ish mi bnei Israel tov mimeni. There was no man amongst the Jewish people better than him. Mishichmo v'mala gavoa mikol ha'am. He was head and shoulders above all of the people. That's where that phrase comes from. Shichmo, shechem is his shoulders. Vamala, from shoulders and up, he was greater than any person. Now, this could mean on a literal sense, that he was literally taller than everybody, which we often have remarked that physical characteristics are very often reflective of a person's inner characteristics. We talked about blindness, physical blindness, and mental blindness. So also, height, when a person is tall above others, there's a certain reflection that has. It's not just a random detail, that he was also morally above other people as well. And on one day, the donkeys of Shaul's father are lost. And so Kish, Shaul's father, says to Shaul, his son, please go and take one of the young lads, and go and walk, go find the donkeys. So Shaul is sent on a mission to find his father's lost donkeys. They travel far and wide, the mountains of Ephraim, the land of Shalisha, and they don't find it. They go to another land and they don't find it. Then they search throughout the tribe of Binyamin. So they're clearly searching high and low, far and wide, going everywhere, and they don't find it. pay close attention to the word matza'u. That's going to be what we call a milat mancha, a key recurring word throughout this chapter. Just in this pasuk, we find it 3 times, I think it is. No, maybe twice. Right, they don't find it. We find it twice, but we're going to see that this idea of limtso, to find something, is going to be a key phrase, and we'll try to explain why we think it is a key phrase. So just keep that in the back of our minds. Verse 5. They come to the district of Tzuf. And Shaul finally turns to his young lad who's with him, and he says, it seems as though we're not going to find these donkeys. Let's go and return home. Lest my father stop worrying about his donkeys, and he'll come to worry about us. In other words, donkeys are donkeys. But if we don't go home, my father's going to start worrying about us, his son and lad, which is obviously more valuable to him than the donkeys. So I think we've exhausted our search. Let's head home. The lad turns to him and says, he says, wait a minute, one last ditch effort, he says. There is a man of God in this city, meaning a prophet. And the man is very well respected. Anything that he speaks ends up coming true. Why not go and to him? Maybe he'll be able to tell us the path that we need to take to find these donkeys. Now, it's interesting, a couple of things. Number one, Shaul does not know about Shemuel. And when he eventually meets him, it's a new person for him to meet. And that's already in and of itself pretty surprising, because we already know that Shemuel was very well known. He was very famous, very widely regarded. And yet Shaul doesn't know who he is. And it seems as though over time, it's not exactly clear how much time elapsed between when Bnei Israel requested a king and God said, okay, to when this story is actually transpiring. It stands to reason not too much time, but maybe enough time, just enough time for people to start to forget a little bit about Shemuel, right? Shemuel maybe isn't as prominent a figure as he once was, to the extent that someone like Shaul doesn't really know where he even is, doesn't even know who he is. He's not going to know him until he actually meets him. That's pretty interesting. Number 2, and Harambam draws a point out of this, that they're willing to go to a Navi, a prophet, to ask about their lost donkeys. What does that tell you?
And that was the reason why we had to have Navi.
Right, that they went to ask them even what? Even mundane things, right? Exactly, right? In other words, you would think that, okay, I'm not only going to go to the prophet to ask them spiritual things, what should I do about this mitzvah, something pertaining to Judaism. It seems that that's not the case, right? The young lad has no problem suggesting, hey, let's go to the Navi, and the Navi will tell us where our donkeys are, which means to suggest that people were allowed, and often did, go to the man of God, the prophet, to ask them for their everyday needs, everyday things, right? As Amy pointed out, we read in last week's parasha that typically people would go to all kinds of dark alleyways and weird places to find out some of those things. And the Torah says, no, I'm going to give you a Navi, and the Navi is going to fill that role. One of those roles is predicting the future, what's going to happen, even on a personal level, even on a quote-unquote mundane level. And Hanabam draws that is acceptable according to halakha. It need not be something only of spirituality when you're asking the Navi a question. Verse 7. Vayomer Shaul le'na'aro. Shaul says to his lad at the suggestion of this plan, V'hineh nelech. Okay, we can go, but we got a problem. Uman navi la'ish. What are we going to bring for the man? Talking about the Navi. Ki halechem azal mikelenu. The bread has finished from our utensils. We don't have any more food. Utshura el nahavi leish ha'elohim. And there is nothing we can bring to the man of God. Ma'itanu. What is with us? What does this tell you about the culture of going to visit the prophet? You didn't come empty-handed, right? If you went to go visit the prophet to ask him a question, you brought him something respectfully, right? Not so much as, I guess you could, it's a little bit of payment, but more on the system of, if I'm going to use the Navi's expertise, I'm going to give him an honoring. And from here, many rabbis learn, many poskim learn, that when a person, a rabbi, a Talmid Chacham, somebody conducts a service for the people, while he's not permitted necessarily to charge and to mandatorily take money from them, it is respectful for them to offer up some kind of a token of appreciation for what it is that he does. And the Hachamim allow this, even though a person is not typically permitted, according to halakha, to be neheneh midivrei Torah, to benefit from the words of Torah and the holiness that they provide for people. To be neheneh, they say, like Elisha, who got room and board, or some sort of token of appreciation in small increments for the time that they have given to the people, is acceptable for them. And in fact, Shaul himself says, if we come empty-handed, we really can't go. We need something in order to be able to bring to them. For what? How can we discuss the Isur or the Heter? So the Isur is all over the place, right? I mean, in terms of earning a living for Torah, right? There's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, for example, says, Al ta'asem atara litgadel bahem. Don't use Torah as a crown to glorify yourself, or kardom lahpor bahem, or an axe to dig into the ground. In other words, you're not supposed to use Torah as your livelihood. That's not how it's meant to be. Torah is meant to be something that elevates the person spiritually. To use it as a business is not acceptable, according to Hachamim. On that Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, Harambam, in his commentary on the Mishnah, has a very, very, very lengthy piece, very lengthy, about this whole issue, right? About earning a living from Torah and earning money from Torah. Then he codifies that in his Hilchot Talmud Torah as well, about not taking money for it. He makes a distinction between Torah she'ba'al peh and Torah she'bichtav, if it's oral Torah or written Torah. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. How do we pay for school teachers and things of that nature is in the first few chapters of the laws of Talmud Torah. And then there's a very important Kesef Mishneh on that. There's a very important Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Kesef Mishneh, who says, even though the Rambam is right idealistically, today it's just not practical anymore to expect people on their level to engage in Torah and Torah teaching and to be rabbis and to not have anybody support them, because otherwise the Torah will not be disseminated properly to the rest of the people. So this is a very, very lengthy conversation, but at the very least, even the Rambam and others agree that for men of God to take a little something as a token of appreciation from the people who should be appreciating them is something which is acceptable. And this story definitely proves that as well. Verse 8, Vayosef hana'ar la'anot et Shaul. The lad persists to answer Shaul. Vayomer, he says, Hine nimtza biyadi reva shekel kasef. He says, behold, I do have in my hand a quarter of a shekel of money, of silver. Venatati le'isha Elohim. We'll give that to the man of God. V'higid lano et darkenu. And he will tell us our path that we should go. Very interesting that Shaul, who is the leader of the journey, has no money, has nothing to give. His lad, however, does have money. Interesting point to note. We'll return back to that. Verse 9, Lefanim bi-Yisrael. And now this is like anytime you see this phrase, Lefanim bi-Yisrael, or Zot Lefanim bi-Yisrael, it's also in Megillat Ruth, which stylistically very similar to Shemuel, have the same author, Shemuel HaNavi. Lefanim bi-Yisrael, it was formerly in Israel, Such was what a person would say when he went to seek out God from the prophet. Let us go and visit the ro'eh. What's a ro'eh? A seer, right? From the language of Ri'iyah. Because to a prophet, what we call a prophet today, they would call in those days a ro'eh. So this is almost like you could put brackets around this pasuk. It's like an author's note that gets inserted into the text so that you can understand the next few verses. Because in the next few verses, they're going to call Shemuel a ro'eh, a seer. And if he doesn't tell you this, you're going to be like, well, who's this ro'eh? What does that mean? So Shemuel, the author over here, inserts a little note. By the way, you should know that in those days when they went to see a prophet, what we call a navi today, in those days, Lefanim bi-Yisrael, they used to call him a ro'eh, a seer, because he sees into the future and into the person, and he knows how to guide them in the proper way. So they're called a ro'eh. Hence, from this point on, when we use ro'eh, that's what we mean. We mean prophet. Verse 10, Vayomet Shaul leNa'aro. Shaul says to his lad, Tov devarecha, you spoke good. Okay, let's do your plan. Lecha nelecha. Let us go onward. Vayalechu el ha'ir. They go to the city, Asher Sham Isha Elohim, where the man of God resides. Verse 11, Hemma olim b'ma'aleh ha'ir. As they were climbing to ascend the town, Vehema matz'u ne'arot. They come in contact with a group of young women, young girls, yotzot lish'ov mayim, who are going out to draw water. This was very common. Young girls would be tasked with the job of going out to draw water from the well, and oftentimes that was a little bit on the outside of the actual populated city. And they would fetch the water and bring it back. Where do we know this from? Moshe and his meeting with Zipporah, Yaakov and his meeting with Rachel, Eliezer, Rivka, right? So in other words, this is what we like to call a motif. This idea of meeting young girls at the well, right? Not the inkwell, the well, right? Is a motif that happens in the Tanakh. It's very often, very, very common, right? I only got that joke. I gave that joke the first time I gave a shiur on Seudat Shlishit in this shul. I was like my second or third week I was in the shul, and I was giving them this idea of the well motif, and someone said, "Oh, it's like the inkwell." I was like, "I don't know what that is." Totally didn't know what that is. So they all started laughing. They're like, "Rabbi, we'll tell you later." Like, not for now, right? Okay, so it is what it is. So in any case, right? So this is something that we see very often, and it's very important, by the way, to highlight that motif. Because what would you expect based on that is going to happen now? You should meet somebody, right? Okay, let's wait and see, right? So that's what we're, as a reader, if we're like, oh, here we go again, right? Girls at the well, drawing thing, a young, eligible, good-looking bachelor in search of something. Okay, Shaul's going to find his nasib, right? That's what we should expect to happen. Instead, we're going to find a very different thing happen as well. And he says to them, Hayesh bazeh ro'eh. A very terse question, right? Is there a seer in the town? Is there a seer here? 12, verse 12. Vata'anena otam vatomarna. And they answer and say as follows. Yesh hine lefanecha. Yes, he is up ahead over here. Maher, hurry. Ata, now. Ki hayom ba la'ir. He has just come to the city today. Ki zeva hayom la'am babama. Because the townspeople are here to give sacrifices on this day. And that's why the prophet is here to assist them in the giving of the sacrifice. The women continue. When you get to the city, you shall surely find him. Try to get him before he goes up to the altar, to eat from the sacrifice. Because the people will not eat without him. Because he's going to bless the offering. Only then will those who are invited to come be able to eat. Now you should go up. Because you were going to find him there right away. So notice again in this pasuk twice the word timtseun, you will find him. Now, what do you notice about the girl's response to Shaul? They're talking way too much. This is right? Shaul's question, he used 3 words. Hayesh bazeh ro'eh. It takes them 2 verses to point out where they're going to go. They're clearly rambling on. So what do you make of that? Huh? Okay, very good, right? So, this is like when my daughter comes home and the boy is making fun of me and I'm like, okay, the boy likes you, right? This is classic, back and forth between men and women, right? So what does it mean? Like the girls are all starstruck. We know Shaul's a very handsome man and they want to... They're flirting, they're talking, they're making conversation. The rabbis say exactly this much, right? They say that they elongated the conversation because they wanted to gaze at Shaul's good looks. That's what they were doing. The rabbis also offer another explanation, but it's not very flattering to women, so I'm going to pass it. They just say women like to talk a lot. But okay. The women like to talk a lot. Okay. Guilty as charged, right? And what is the bama? It is acceptable at this time because don't forget what has happened already. Shiloh was destroyed. Shiloh was destroyed and the Aron has been displaced, which means there is no central place anymore. During this time period, they had moved the Mishkan operations to Nov and then later to Givon, but during those places, it did not have the same central authority as it did when it was in the Mishkan for close to 4 centuries. So during this time, Bamot were permissible, and you could see because Shemuel himself is engaging in the Bama with them as well, which means it must have been mutar. At that time, it's acceptable. So we went in and out of periods of time when Bamot were permissible versus not permissible. During the time of the conquest of Eretz Israel, permissible because we didn't make everybody go back and forth to Mishkan. Once we had conquered and settled the land during the 369 years of the Mishkan in Shiloh, it was not permitted. Once it was destroyed, as we read about a few chapters ago, it became permissible again to use Bamot, and that's what they're doing over here. Yeah. So the women over here are pointing out to Shaul where he needs to go. And of course, as we said, kind of flirting and stuff like that with him. But Shaul doesn't bite. Verse 14 says, they go to the city. They pass the girls. They come into the center of the city. And Shemuel comes out to greet them, which is very surprising because at this point, we've been looking at Shaul and his lad searching for Shemuel. All of a sudden, Shemuel comes to greet them. Seems like what? Shemuel was expecting them, right? And that's what the pasuk now is going to tell us why it is that he went out to greet them. La'alota bama. But before we read that pasuk in pasuk 15, just make a mental note of the fact that the story with the girls does not turn out the way we thought it would have based on the typical biblical motif, which is Shaul uses very terse language with them, does not engage in banter with them, and moves on, and does not have any sort of relationship with these girls. He does not strike up a marriage or anything of that nature. That's something to keep in the back of our minds. All of these are details that the Pesukim want us to be aware of as building our understanding of who Shaul was, where he came from, what type of person he was, which is going to set the stage for him being a good king. Just keep some of these details in mind, and then we'll organize them all together as we finish the chapter. As we noted, Shemuel came out to greet Shaul. So verse 15, Vadonai gala et ozen Shemuel. Shemuel, the author over here, actually tells us that God had already come to Shemuel. Gala et ozen. He revealed to the ear of Shemuel, Yom echad lifne bo Shaul lemor. One day prior to Shaul even reaching his town. Ka'et mahar eshlach elecha ish. God said to Shemuel, a day from now, I'm going to send a man towards you, me'eretz Binyamin, from the tribe of Binyamin, shachto lenagid al ami Israel, and you will anoint him as the leader of the Jewish people. The nagid from the language of the sayer, the speaker, the one who's going to lead the Jewish people. Vehoshia et ami miyad Pelishtim. He will save the people from the hands of the Philistines. Ki ra'iti et ami, for I have seen my people. Ki ba'at sa'akato elai. And their cry has come to me. Any interesting notes on that pasuk? It didn't happen yet, right? So this is all a premonition for what's going to take place. What about the language? Who hears any resemblance in the language? Hoshia et ami, I will save my people. Ki ra'iti et ami, I have seen my people and their pain. Very good. It's very reminiscent of the language that we find by Hashem hearing the language. Ka'et mahad is an interesting one. That's like when Sarah is giving birth. I don't exactly know how to make the connection to that story, but I think the end of this pasuk has shades of the Jewish people calling out to God for help and salvation from the oppression of the Egyptians. And in here, it's just the oppression of the Philistines switching in. Why do you think the author might want to reference the story of the Jewish people calling out to God for salvation in Egypt? When did that pasuk get mentioned in the story of Egypt? Right before Moshe is chosen as the leader. So in other words, this is a repeat again of why does God come and choose a leader? He chooses a leader because the people are suffering. They're being oppressed by a foreign enemy. And now they're calling out to God for salvation. And so God steps in to choose a leader, much the way he did for Moshe. So too, he is doing this for Shaul as well. But what's a little bit interesting is there's some questions that we should start to ask ourselves. Question number one is it sounds like over here, God is the one who is idealistically choosing the king, right? It's almost like God is saying, just like in Egypt, you called out to me, you cried out, so I chose you, Moshe, so I'm choosing you a king. But is that really true? In last chapter, it was the Jewish people who asked God for a king, and God wasn't happy to appoint them a king. So this seems to be a very different narrative than what we got in the last chapter. Last chapter seems as that God begrudgingly accepted to the Jewish people's request of a king. Here it sounds like God says, oh, I got to choose them a king. They're crying out to me in oppression and they need my help. So I'm going to choose them a valiant king who's going to lead them and save them the way I chose Moshe Rabbeinu. Those two things don't exactly mesh with each other. So that's one question that we have to ask ourselves. Question two, it says that he's going to save the Jewish people from the Philistine. But we already know 2 chapters ago, the Jews killed the Philistine in that battle which was led by Shemuel. And the Pesukim there told us that the Philistine never rose up again against the Jewish people to attack them. So what's going on over here? I need to save the Jewish people from the Philistine. Doesn't seem to necessarily add up. So we're starting to not only build a profile for Shaul, but we're also starting to see some very different perspectives in the way that the story is unfolding, different than some of the introductory chapters that we've seen until this point. So we have some questions to answer as well. We're trying to build things here a little bit before we answer some of these things and sort of put it all together. Let's continue reading what happens over here in the story before we try to attack some of these details. We might not get to everything today, but we'll see how much we can do. Verse 17, Ushmuel ra'a et Shaul. Shmuel sees Shaul. Vadonai anahu, and God declares to Shemuel, Hine ha'ish asher amarti elecha. Behold, this is the man who I already told you, Ze ya'atzor be'ami. This is the one who's going to govern my people. Verse 18, Vayigash Shaul et Shemuel betoch hasha'ar. Now this, by the way, that last line was only said to Shemuel. God called it out only to Shemuel. He's the Navi. Shaul does not hear that. Vayigash Shaul et Shemuel betoch hasha'ar. Shaul approaches Shemuel from the gate. Vayomer, he says, Hagida nali, please tell us, Eze bet haro'eh. Whose is the house of the ro'eh, of the seer? He's talking to Shemuel. He doesn't even know that he's talking to Shemuel. He wants Shemuel to point him in the direction of the home of the seer. Vayan Shemuel et Shaul. Shemuel says to Shaul, Vayomer, he says, Anochi haro'eh, I am the seer. Ale lefanai habama, come in front of me at the altar. And you're going to be my special guest of honor. You're going to eat with me today. And I will send you on your way in the morning. After you tell me whatever is on your mind, whatever you want to discuss with me. And by the way, says Shemuel, right, which probably freaked Shaul out a little bit at that time, but not exactly, because he tells him he's a prophet. And to those donkeys that you had lost, that you've been searching for, Hayom sheloshet hayamim, for 3 days. Al tasem et libecha lahem. Don't pay any attention to them. Ki nimtza'u, they were found. Notice that word again. Ulmi kol hemdat Yisrael, halo lecha ulchol bet avicha. And for whom is all Israel yearning, if not for you and your ancestral home? So in other words, Shemuel tells Shaul, it's not by coincidence that you happened to come here. You've been guided by the hand of God to reach this point. All of the Jewish people are yearning for you. They're all looking to you. You're going to be their guy, right? And this is why I kept stressing the idea of the nimtza'u, of that language of to find, or limtzo. Because what does it seem to indicate when we say, I found this, I found that? What sort of impression does that give you? That things are happening in what type of way? Much more random, right? We happened upon each other. I found what I was looking for. Right? It seems much more coincidental. The reason why the text is emphasizing almost 7 times into this point, this idea of mitzi'ah, of finding it, is that it appears to Shaul that all of this is happening in a very random, coincidental type of way. But Shemuel at the very end tells him, no, that's not what's happening over here. There's a deeper force that is acting upon us at this point that has brought you to this stage. It is that you are going to be chosen to be the king. All of the Jewish people are yearning for you and looking to you. You've been brought here by the divine command, not simply by happenstance of your donkeys. Don't worry about those. There's bigger things that we need to take care of, you and me, says Shemuel to Shaul. Now Shaul is starting to get the picture a little bit more, starting to see what's happening. But as is typical for leaders who are informed that they're going to be the leader of the Jewish people, if he's a good leader, what's his first reaction when he's told, you're going to be the leader of the Jewish people? Why me? Pick someone else. Who am I? Those are usually the typical answers. People like Moshe, Yirmiyahu, and others, classically, when they're chosen for a position of prominence, deflect that position and say, who am I? I'm not worthy. That's a certain modesty and sniut and humility that they have for themselves. And we find this by Shaul as well. Vaya'an Shaul vayomer. Shaul responds to Shemuel and says, Halo ben Yemini anochi. But behold, I am a member of the tribe of Binyamin, miketane shivtei Israel, from the youngest or smallest of the tribes of the Jewish people. Umishpachti hatseira, and even within that tribe, I'm from the family that's the smallest and youngest of all those families. Mikol mishpechot shivtei Binyamin, from all of the different families amongst the tribe of Binyamin. So he's telling Shemuel, you chose the smallest, youngest tribe, and the youngest, smallest family from the youngest, smallest tribe. That doesn't make any sense. Why should you speak such words of this nature towards me? So we see Shaul's humility and his modesty come out in a genuine way when he's told that he's going to be in a position of prominence. Verse 22. Actually, before we read verse 22, what do you think the meaning is when he says that I'm from Binyamin, which is Kitaneh Shivtei Israel, which is either the youngest or smallest of the tribes of Israel? There's a couple of meanings potentially there. What do you think he means by that when he says it? What does it mean to be from the smallest? Why are they the smallest? Okay, very good. That's what I wanted to reference over here. I think there could be two explanations. One explanation is Binyamin is the youngest of all of the tribes because he's the last born. So why should you pick the youngest from the last born? You should pick a tribe like Reuben or Yehuda or somebody like that to be it. Why are you choosing from Binyamin? Additionally, Ketaneh over here can mean the smallest tribe. Now, why are they the smallest tribe? Well, if you look through the Torah, typically the tribe of Binyamin has always been very small as compared to some of the other tribes. However, we know that we're coming off the heels of the dreadful story of Pilegesh Begiv'ah. And in the story of Pilegesh Begiv'ah, the concubine, right, that had that whole disastrous story in the civil war, the Jewish people decimated the tribe of Binyamin to the point that there wasn't a single woman left alive from the tribe of Binyamin. They had to take women from other tribes after decimating them and pair them up with the tribe of Binyamin to be able to procreate to keep the tribe of Binyamin alive. So after being decimated from that war, it's very clear that the tribe of Binyamin is still in recovery mode from that dreadful story. And so Shaul is saying, even furthermore, why should you pick from our tribe? We're the smallest, and we're the smallest because of this terrible story that we have looming over our heads. What are the rest of the Jewish people going to say when you choose specifically from our tribe to be the king of the Jewish people? What are we deserving to be the tribe? We want to hide away, right? We don't want anybody to be, we don't want to be in the spotlight right now. We're still trying to get rid of the bad reputation that we have and the devastating effects of this story of Pilegesh Begiv'ah. But that's exactly the point, right? Exactly the point is God typically chooses the underdog. He always chooses the least likely candidate to be the king of the Jewish people. Why is it that God always chooses the least likely person that you would expect to be the leader of the Jewish people? Why not pick somebody who's fits the bill, fits the criteria a little bit more? Just because we like the underdog story, huh? So maybe there's genuine qualities. That's not to say that there aren't very good people in other areas, right? But it's because it's to avoid haughtiness, right? It's to avoid getting too full of yourself. And that's the ultimate issue with appointing a king. The ultimate fear, we say in the parasha about the Kohen, about the Melech, that the Melech should not get a big heart. All of the restrictions in the Torah, and I'm going to mention this even further detail in a moment, but all of the restrictions in the Torah, the limitations on the king, are designed to keep the king in check, to make sure that he understands his job is not about him. He is merely an extension and a messenger of God. If I choose the most likely, most handsome, most prominent, wealthy person to put into that position, the ego is already there. You already have the ego, and it just fuels it even more, and it's more likely that it's going to go sideways. By choosing a candidate like Shaul, who we see his humility, who we see that he's not enticed by women, who we see does not have riches, he's not very wealthy. So I might as well mention it now. I was going to mention it a little bit, but all of these details that we're picking up on in this origin story of Shaul, they're all geared to show you why Shaul fits beautifully the criteria, the limitations that the Torah laid out for a king. The Torah said the king shouldn't have too much money. Shaul's lad, his Na'ad, has the money. He doesn't have the money. He's broke, right? So he's obviously not somebody who's chasing after materialism and monetary wealth. He's not enticed by the women who are attracted to him. He avoids them at all costs, right? And so we maybe have the right candidate who's going to avoid lo yarbe lo nashim, to not have too many women, to become enticed by women. And we also have somebody who is modest, somebody who's not going to be haughty, somebody who says, I don't want to be the king. So Shaul possesses many of the qualities that fit nicely what the Torah is trying to get at when they're choosing a king that is not going to fit the issues. Yeah. Oh, okay, good. So that's the other side of the coin. Very good.
All this praise right now is in the negative. He didn't do this and didn't do that. If you think of the story of Moshe, his origin story is he went out and he
saw his brethren.
He went out and he defended people.
Right.
That's what he did.
Right.
He helped the girls.
Right. We see a lot of his positive character.
Exactly.
We see a little bit by Shaul searching for his father's donkeys, going to see the prophet and so on. I think that's the big thing, though. Within the story, which I think mostly highlights Shaul's positive qualities and why he fits the bill of a king, as well embedded in it is also Shaul's major quality of struggle. And his quality of struggle is he's so modest and so humble that it will often be paralyzing to Shaul, where he will not act in strength and in confidence. Rather, he will rescind himself and allow others to dictate his actions. So when the people are putting pressure on him, as we'll see in a few chapters, to give the sacrifice before Shemuel gets there, even though Shemuel has commanded Shaul not to bring the sacrifice until he gets there, Shaul caves to the pressure. And when he doesn't destroy the Amalekim, because he says, the people told me, why should we kill the animals and why should we do this? He's constantly blaming the people for putting too much pressure on him, and he caves to the pressure of the people. So Shaul is great in that he has this modesty and this humility, but when the humility crosses too far over to a point where now he's not taking charge as the king to do what Hashem and Shemuel have told him is the right thing to do, when humility leads to a lack of self-confidence, that's Shaul's downfall. And that's his problem. His greatest asset also becomes his most difficult thing that he needs to deal with. He's too humble to the point where he fails to accomplish what he needs to do. And that's embodied in this story when who leads the charge? He says, let's go home. We're not going to find the donkeys. And the Na'ar, the young lad, comes up with another plan and says, let's do this. And Shaul says, okay, let's go along. In other words, Shaul is somewhat of a follower instead of using his qualities to be that leader, to make those strong decisions. And that's a little bit of foreshadowing. So although he has many great qualities that are beautifully fitting in with what the Torah is seeking from a king, from avoiding getting that haughtiness, on the other hand, he's going to have to balance it. And that's going to be his major struggle. And we'll see that Shaul will slip and fall a few times because of that. And ultimately, that will be why the kingdom is torn away from him and given to David. Esther does have to save the day. We'll throw in that a woman needed to come and save the man. Yes, she did. So I think that's hard to say. You're saying, is there sabotage going on over here a little bit? I don't know if we can really answer that. I don't want to say what's meant to be. In other words, we as the reader have to read the story not with the end in mind, right? That's although I know we're skipping and we're moving back and we're seeing foreshadowing, and it's very easy to look at it like that, sometimes you have to read Tanakh without knowing the end in mind, right? Because then it's very easy to say, oh, it was doomed from the start. No, it really wasn't, because overwhelmingly the story paints the positive qualities of Shaul, who's set up for success if he's willing to overcome some of his challenges. But nobody's perfect, and that's every king, no matter how great they are, David, Shaul, every king who's great is going to have their own particular quality that they're going to have to grapple with and struggle with and try to overcome. And some are more successful, some are less successful. Shlomo is going to have tremendous struggles. So being that we're, in the end of the day, human beings, as great as these individuals are, they are primed for success, but they have challenges and hurdles that they're going to have to overcome, not unlike ourselves. Not unlike ourselves. All of us are given beautiful qualities. We're set up for success. Hashem has given us tremendous resources, but we all have those things, our skeletons in the closet, the demons that haunt us in our own personalities, and we have to find ways to overcome them. And we can learn from these biblical characters how they were able to be successful and how they grappled with it. And unfortunately, they sometimes made errors, and how they dealt with it is critical as well. So I don't want to say that he was sabotaged God at this point. I think that's exactly the point. Just to go back for a minute to the question we asked, that how come this chapter is portraying it as if God is idealistically choosing the king, when in last chapter it was more of a begrudging. So I think the answer is that it's both. It's both. Really, we know the king, and we've already illustrated this, the institution of a king is a very complex institution. It has many positive qualities to it. It has many negative qualities to it, as do the individuals who will assume that role. Many positive qualities to them, many negative qualities to them. So the struggle is intense for all of them to deal with their own personal issues in this position of kingship, which is a hard position to navigate as a human being. How do I represent God while still leading the people, not letting my ego get in the way, even though I'm the most important person? These are the major questions that our books seek to answer. And so it's both. Yes, God said it was never the intent in the first place. It was a little begrudging that I gave you the king. But now that I'm giving you the king, I'm going to give you the best one possible. And we're going to look at the positive elements of how he can go ahead and benefit you.
I mean, we need to do that.
God could be both at the same time.
We need to have it that way.
So that's how we need to look at it. Yeah, 100%. This is Rav Mordechai Breuer's way of looking at things. He says, when you see two chapters that conflict with each other, they're coming from two different perspectives, two different angles. Often you could have back-to-back chapters, each one looking at things from different. They're both true. They're both true. In many ways, choosing the king was a secondary option, but in many ways, it is a primary option, and it could be good. And so God is doing both at the same time, and we as humans are balancing both at the same time. Right. In other words, it could have been a positive thing. Shlach lecha, I'm letting you, but you really might not be good. There's more room for error. There's things are not often black and white. They're more often than not very gray in nature. And how we as human beings navigate them is the challenge. Most people like to take the be safe and be cautious approach of not getting yourself involved in something that has the potential to be bad. But in this situation, Bnei Israel got themselves into that. So now how are we going to go about choosing the best person and navigating it in the best type of way? And this is what Shaul is now going to be thrust into. Very, very important. Verse 22, Vayikach Shemuel et Shaul ve'et na'aro vayiviem lishkata vayiten lahem makom berosh hakiruim vehema kishloshim is. So Shemuel takes Shaul and his servant, he brings them into the hall, and he gives them a place at the head of all the guests. There's about 30 other people sitting together about to eat at this banquet, and he puts Shaul and his servant at the top. He says to the chef, give him the portion of meat that I told you, that I gave to you. That I said, that I gave to you and told you to set aside. In other words, Shemuel was already preparing. He told him to take a very hashuv portion of meat, set it aside, serve that to Shaul. Shaul, ויאמר הנה הנשאר שים לפניך אכול כי למועד שמור לך לאמור העם קראתי ויאכל שאול עם שמואל ביום ההוא. They eat together, they're rejoicing together, they're eating the best of the meat, and there's a very nice banquet and festivity is ensuing. Now, this is in front of other people. Now Shemuel pulls Shaul aside and they go into a private area for a conversation. Verse 25, they get off of the altar and they go into the city. Shemuel speaks to Shaul on the roof. What is the roof? The roof is a place of secrecy, of privacy. They wake. Now, the Torah does not tell us, the Tanakh does not tell us what they spoke about, but we could assume that he was prepping him and telling him what's going to take place, that Shaul is going to be the next king. Verse 26, they wake up and it is the break of dawn. Shemuel calls to Shaul from the roof saying, come up here and I will send you forth. So they have another conversation on the roof. Shaul arose and the two of them, Shemuel and he, go outside. So as they're walking towards the edge of town, Shemuel says to Shaul, tell your servant to go ahead of us. He doesn't even trust that the servant should hear what they're talking about. You stand here like right now, and I'm going to give you over the word of God. And immediately as chapter 10 begins, Shemuel is going to anoint Shaul as the king and make him the king in front of nobody, privately, just the two of them. And it will actually take several chapters before anybody will find out that Shaul is going to be king. His first act is going to be before the Jewish people actually know that he's king. So there's a lot of secrecy surrounding the choice of Shaul to be the king. And that also raises an eyebrow. Why are we being so secret? The Jewish people have asked for a king. We know that a king is coming, but Shemuel wants to choose the king. God wants Shemuel to choose the king privately, in secret. No fanfare, no big celebrations. Again, it seems as though all of this is to avoid that haughtiness from coming in. Shaul is going to be chosen privately on the side. And only later will there start to be any kind of fanfare or festivity that will have to ensue, obviously, because eventually the people are going to find out and they're going to, get excited about that. But at least Shaul should know that when he was first chosen, he was chosen just him and the Navi. It's just you and God. You are a representation of God. You are an extension of God. And your job is to fulfill God's will. And that's it. Don't worry about the publicity. Don't worry about the notoriety. It's all separate. You are chosen to go ahead and to be the king, to be the representative of Hashem. So in this chapter, we've seen some of the qualities of Shaul, why Shaul was chosen. We also saw maybe a foreshadowing of Shaul himself's downfall. We talked a little bit about the tribe of Binyamin. We talked about some of the distinctions between the last chapter and why that one looked like a negative versus this chapter and why it goes ahead and looks like a positive. So I definitely think that we churned out this chapter in a really positive way. We noticed the word matzah as a key word, not having coincidence, but that all of this was guided and orchestrated by God, and God trying to identify and find the right person who's going to be put into a very difficult position of being the first king of the Jewish people as we begin to relate to this very new experience of having a king. That's a good suggestion. In other words, if you just thrust Shaul right into it in front of everybody, it could be overwhelming for him. Maybe he needs time to digest. We're going to see that actually it's going to be amazing. Shaul's going to go home and he's not going to tell his father. He's not going to tell his father. He's going to see his father's going to pass over it. He's going to pretend like it didn't happen, right? Again, the extreme humility that we see of someone like Shaul. He doesn't even want to tell his own father. He wants to hold to the secret dealings between him and Shemuel. But yes, also maybe to give Shaul some time to process and to figure out what he wants to do before he gets put into that situation. I'm thinking of this is going to sound make fun of me for this one, but like the Princess Diaries, that movie. Okay, so make fun. Right, where she finds out that she's a princess, but she doesn't tell anybody. So yeah, sometimes a person needs to be able to figure out on their own if they're mentally capable of doing such a job before it gets out to other people, before the fanfare sort of overwhelms them, and now they're stuck in a situation that maybe they weren't necessarily prepared for. Just wanted me to see. Yeah, go ahead.
So much of it is irrelevant.
Seemingly, right. Right. There's a lot of, it is a long-winded pedic when you think about how we typically consolidate those types of things. But again, it's all there because we're trying to give you as much information that you could extract about who Shaul is. The author wants you to build a profile, a perception of who Shaul is, where he comes from, because it's not fair so much to Shaul if we just read what he did as king and then read about how he failed, right? We want to know why he failed, right? Why did he stumble? And now, by the way, you have tremendous appreciation for Shaul. Shaul stumbled not because he was defiant of God. He stumbled because he had a positive quality that exceeded where he needed to draw the line, right? And that's a whole different perspective on somebody. He's not a bad person. He's not a defiant individual against God. He didn't say, God, you told me to do this and I'm not doing it. Shaul is somebody who is a paradigm of humility and modesty, positive qualities that are necessary to be chosen for that job. But when you don't know how to properly balance it and draw the line and not let it cross, that's when the mistakes happen. That's something that we as human beings can all relate to. We all have those types of things, positive qualities that when we don't harness them properly, we're unable to achieve what our destiny really has in store for us. And that's something that we should reflect on as well. And is not easily done, right? Not easily done. It's very, very challenging. Now you have a more nuanced profile of what Shaul is and why he stumbles. And as a result, we could appreciate him a little bit more and who he was. It's not a simple thing to be chosen the first king of the Jewish people in a way that Hashem lechatechila chose him. That's the greatness of Shaul. Shichmo v'amala. In ish tov b'Yisrael. There's nobody better than him in the Jewish people. So we need to have those background before we start to read about his mistakes and what he did wrong and so on and so forth. I think that's very important. Any other thoughts, questions? Good. Okay, we close the book on chapter 9. Be'ezrat Hashem, chapters 10 and 11 coming up. We'll read a little bit more about Shaul getting into that position, some of his first actions as king of the Jewish people. Baruch Adonai Ne'olam. Amen ve'amen.